identify and prevent threats to our national security without sacrificing the civil liberties of American citizens. I urge my colleagues to join me in support of this bill, and I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
On our side, I would begin our discussion by yielding to the distinguished senior member of Judiciary, ranking member of Immigration, Zoe Lofgren of California, 3 minutes.
The gentlelady from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Speaker, I urge this body to reject this bill. You know, the surveillance bill raises several serious constitutional and civil liberties issues that Congress needs to address and has not addressed in this bill, and I'd like to discuss just one of those. Congress should prohibit the federal government from intentionally searching for information on a U.S. person in a data pool amassed lawfully under Section 702 of FISA, should such a data pool ever be amassed, unless the searching official has a warrant. Now, the FISA Amendments Act of 2008 does not make clear that the government must obtain a warrant prior to searching for information acquired incidentally on a U.S. person in a large pool of data that the government has already lawfully obtained under Section 702, should such a data pool ever be amassed. Instead, the information about the U.S. persons in such a situation is subject to minimization procedures adopted by the Attorney General, and that must be approved by the FISA court. But that does not explicitly include a warrant requirement, which I think the Constitution requires. The prohibition on reverse targeting, where the government deliberately targets a non-U.S. person for the purpose of acquiring information about the U.S. person at the other end of the line, is not a substitute for the warrant requirement to search a database for a U.S. person should such a database ever be amassed under Section 702. Minimization procedures are not a substitute for a warrant in such a case. Now, I think that the government needs to comply with the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution all the time. I think that the privacy of Americans should not be subject to the lower standard of minimization procedures. That's not in the Constitution. And I think also that when we think that we should trade the protections that our founding fathers devised for us in the United States Constitution in the effort to buy safety, we're mistaken. We can be safe while still complying with the Constitution of the United States. I'm mindful that we began this Congress reading most of the United States Constitution on the floor of this House. It's ironic indeed that we should be ending this Congress with a bill that does violation to that very body. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Lundgren, who is the chairman of the Administration Committee here in the House, a senior member of the Judiciary Committee, and a former Attorney General of California.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the extension of the FISA amendments of 2008. I would just have to say this is critical to the protection of the American people. With the events of the last couple of days, we need not be reminded of this solemn responsibility. One day after the 11th anniversary of 9/11. If you'll recall, one of the main points made by the 9/11 Commission in their after-action report was that we as a nation had not done enough, that is, the government of the United States had not done enough to connect the dots to warn us sufficiently to protect against the attack which caused the death of over 3,000 on our homeland. In order to connect the dots, that is, the items of information, the intelligence you have to have the dots, you have to have the intelligence. That's precisely what the extension of these amendments will allow us to do. But initially, it's important to understand from the outset of this debate what this legislation would do as well as what it does not do. We are seeking to address the essential need for us to be able to monitor communications by terrorists and other foreign adversaries located outside the United States. We're not debating the Patriot Act here. We're not talking about national security letters. We're not talking about those things that are directed at Americans. The annual certification procedures provided under the FISA Amendments Act do not allow the targeting of Americans outside the United States. Thus, if an American is targeted anywhere in the world, or if a person is targeted within the United States, an individualized court order is required. In cases involving a foreign terrorist outside the United States, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court approves annual certifications submitted by the Attorney General and the Director of National Intelligence. This is a court made up of Article III judges, judges with lifetime appointments, with the independence that was accorded them under the Constitution. And I would remind my colleagues that the appellate review, the appellate division of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is also comprised of Article III judges. It is important to note we're not providing for warrantless surveillance here. In fact, the FISA Amendment Act has enhanced the statutory protections afforded to U.S. persons under the law, because it was for the first time under these amendments that we wish to extend that we required an individual FISA court order to conduct overseas intelligence collections on U.S. citizens and permanent residents. Even if they're overseas, we now require that. It was not required by statute before that. Before that, the Attorney General approved such collections against U.S. persons outside the U.S. pursuant to an executive order of the President. We all know that executive orders of the President can be changed by a President while in office or a succeeding President. I would submit that if you are concerned about civil liberties, and I assume everybody in this debate is, returning to the good old days prior to the enactment of the FISA Amendments Act is not a step forward for civil liberties. It should also be understood that we're not seeking to extend the underlying Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in its entirety. Today we're attempting to achieve the rather modest purpose of the 2008 amendments. Again, court approval of annual certification by the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Attorney General, identifying categories of foreign intelligence agents outside the United States is required. An individualized court order is required in other cases. The legislative history of FISA is instructive. The House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence report that accompanied FISA in the initial act in 1978 clearly expressed Congress's intent to exclude overseas intelligence activities from the reach of FISA. These are the words of that report. The committee has explored the feasibility of broadening this legislation to apply overseas, but has concluded that certain problems and unique characteristics involved in overseas surveillance preclude the simple extension of this bill to overseas surveillance. In other words, overseas surveillance was never the focus of the 1978 Act. Rather, it focused on domestic surveillance of persons located within the United States to ensure that there were protections in that regard. The FISA Amendment Act...
I'll yield the gentleman an additional minute.
Gentleman's recognized for additional
The
minute.
FISA Amendments Act under consideration here today requires individualized court order in cases where an American is the target, no matter where they may be located. Here's the reason why this is important. It is the change in communications, the nature of communications, that required us to do the amendments. If we fail to pass this, we will, as former DNI Director McConnell stated, we will lose two-thirds of those dots, those bits of information, the intelligence that we need to connect to protect us. We will put in very much manner the country at risk. If you look at a simple risk analysis, you have to do threat, you have to do vulnerability, you have to do consequence. We can figure out what the vulnerability is by our inspection of our own resources and infrastructure. We can figure out what the consequences are. What we have to have in order to figure out the threat is a means of collecting intelligence. We have to pass this law, a bipartisan law. I recall being here and having the former Speaker of the House spend, I think, 7 minutes arguing on behalf of this, and the gentleman who is number 2 on the Democratic side as well. It has never been partisan. Hopefully we can have a bipartisan support expressed in the vote for these amendments.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 15 seconds
Gentleman's recognized.
to let my distinguished colleague and friend from California know that we're in complete agreement with most of what he said, except that all we want to do is limit this to a 3-year measure instead of 5 years. Now, there's a compromise you can't turn away from. And at this point, I would yield, sir, to the distinguished senior member from Judiciary Committee, Jerry Nadler. I yield 3 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the FISA Amendments Act of 2012. If we had had an opportunity to evaluate this law based on experience with it and to consider some amendments and alternatives, this opposition would not be necessary. But the Republican majority has once again told the members of this House and the American people that it's my way or the highway. While it is certainly appropriate for our government to gather foreign intelligence, and while some degree of secrecy is obviously necessary, it is also vital in a free society that we limit government, protect the constitutional rights of Americans here and abroad, and limit warrantless spying to genuine foreign intelligence. Unfortunately, we have seen repeatedly how even the very minimal restraints Congress put on FISA have been violated. We should address those abuses. Congress has an obligation to exert more control over spy agencies than simply to give them a blank check for another 5 years. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Conyers, had an amendment that would have shortened the sunset by 2 years, but we won't even have a chance to consider it, perhaps because some of our Republican colleagues might also want to support such an amendment. As a result, we will not revisit the law until after the end of the next presidential term. And if we had cut shorter this extension, we could do what we should have done but haven't. Hold hearings, look into how the law is operating, and decide what amendments and protections are necessary to make sure it operates right so that we can collect the intelligence without violating the constitutional rights of Americans. I had an amendment that would have required the Attorney General to make publicly available a summary of each decision of the FISA Court and the FISA Court of Review that includes a significant construction of Section 702, which allows warrantless surveillance with appropriate security redactions and editing. Many American citizens and others who have nothing to do with foreign intelligence gathering are caught up in this surveillance, and government has an obligation to protect their rights. The FISA Court is supposed to do that, and we need to ensure that the law and the courts are working. Disclosure of classified information is not needed to know whether the court performs meaningful oversight of the executive branch, applies the minimization standards correctly, and whether or not we ought to amend the law. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner, said, quote, rather than playing the numbers game either with the actual targets or the people who are incidentally surveilled, perhaps decisions of the FISA Court, particularly the review of the FISA Court appropriately redacted, would be able to give us the answer to that question. I have always been one that favored disclosure." Close quote. The gentleman from Wisconsin is right. If the FISA Court is just a rubber stamp of the executive branch, we and the public should know that. And if the court really does provide meaningful oversight and meaningful limitations on the executive branch, we and the public should know that too. But we won't get to discover that or to debate that. Failure to do so is a dereliction of our constitutional duty to protect the constitutional rights of American citizens and a betrayal of our liberties. I urge my colleagues to reject this legislation and demand that we properly consider this very important issue by a somewhat shorter extension and by proper hearings and examination of the limitations and the workings of this law. I thank the gentleman and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I want to thank the chairman for yielding to a contrary point of view. Mr. Speaker, FISA allows the government to target foreign nationals and to intercept their communications, even with American citizens, without a warrant as required by the Fourth Amendment. Now, we're told, don't worry, the law requires that any irrelevant information collected in this manner be disregarded. Well, here's the problem. The enforcement of this provision is itself shrouded in secrecy, making the potential for abuse substantial and any remedy unlikely. Secret courts and warrantless surveillance are not compatible with the free society or the English common law or the American Constitution. Now, we're told FISA is necessary to stop terrorist plots and that this protection trumps privacy or due process concerns. Well, Ben Franklin answered that argument years ago when he warned us that those who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. In fact, America's security is far better assured as a thriving, free society in a world that respects her strength and fears her just vengeance.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 20 seconds to commend the gentleman from California's statement in this regard. And I also point out that on the subject of transparency, two senators, one from Oregon, the other from Colorado, asked the Director of National Intelligence how many Americans are affected by this law. 10 more seconds. The answer, we don't know. Now, we don't know if he meant that he didn't want to tell us and he knew, or that he honestly didn't know. Either response explanation is inadequate. And now, Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to yield to the distinguished gentlelady from Houston, Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson Lee, and I will yield her 3 minutes.
The gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to Mr. Speaker, I am delighted to join the chairman of the full committee and the ranking member of the full committee in this vigorous debate on the Constitution. But I'm also delighted that the ranking member has indicated by his reference to the previous speaker that this is a bipartisan challenge and question about the reauthorization. This does not have a partisan place. It does have a place in the Constitution. And as I do this, might I take just a moment, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, just to acknowledge the loss of our Americans who fell in Libya, the Ambassador Stevens and those who were securing him. It is a recognition that we live in a difficult world. But one of the distinctive aspects of America is that we live in a free country, that we are willing to accept the distinctions and differences of all people, and we respect the privacy and the Fourth Amendment. So I might refresh my fellow colleagues as to what FISA does from the very beginning. It is electronic surveillance, physical searches, the installation and use of PIN registers and trap and trace devices, and demands for the production of physical items. Although FISA is designed for intelligence gathering and not for the collection of criminal evidence, the law applies to activities to which a Fourth Amendment warrant requirement would apply if they were conducted in a criminal investigation. Members need to understand there are questions of the Fourth Amendment right here. So what those of us who have a concern on this reauthorization are asking for, simple premise. We want to join with Congressman Conyers in his simple amendment that allowed for greater congressional oversight and the protection of the Fourth Amendment as it relates to Americans by shortening the reauthorization to 2015 from 2017. It intrudes the Congress properly in oversight. In addition, there should be more transparency in the surveillance program, such as requiring the creation of unclassified versions of the intelligence assessments of the surveillance program, requiring the creation of unclassified summaries. And I introduced an amendment, a simple amendment. We all have respect for the Inspector General's office. That is one independent force in our agencies that most members of Congress will not challenge. My amendment indicated that I wanted to require a report by the Inspector General of the Department of Justice and the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community on the implementation of the surveillance program under the FISA Amendments Act of 2008. Now let me try to find out what are the horrifically liberal groups that are concerned about this. What about the American Library Association, the Association of Research Libraries, the very well-respected Brennan Center for Justice and the Center for Democracy and Technology, the OpenGovernment.org? What we are simply saying today, and we hope our colleagues will listen on both sides of the aisle, yes, we can reauthorize this legislation, but no, we cannot abdicate the questions of congressional oversight. Today we had a hearing on the abuse of power. The only issue in abuse of power is whether or not we respect the three branches of government. That is the argument we're making today. Do you respect the three branches of government, the people's house, who represent the people, who by themselves cannot defend themselves against this extensive reauthorization? And so I ask...
30 seconds.
I thank the distinguished gentleman.
Additional seconds.
In the course of this particular legislation, we had to contend with such things as warrantless wiretapping, which again, as I indicated, the need for intruding of the Congress is a respect of the liberties of which we want to protect. And so I would ask my colleagues to yield to transparency, yield to a shorter extension, make this bill stand on its own 2 feet in juxtaposed to the Constitution while we mourn those who have fallen. We respect that this is a free country. Today, we're not acting on that freedom by giving us the congressional oversight that is necessary. I ask my colleagues to reject the present form of this bill. I beg the Senate to look more readily at a shorter extension and more transparency. With that, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from Texas is
Mr.
recognized.
Speaker, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy, a particularly active member of the Judiciary Committee.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your leadership on this and a host of other issues on the Judiciary Committee. Also, Mr. Speaker, this week has provided tragic reminders that the world is a dangerous place. We're targets, Mr. Speaker, even from people we have helped in the past, with lethal consequences because we represent freedom, liberty, and tolerance, even among those with whom we disagree. Mr. Speaker, each of us is asked when we go back home to our districts, can Congress agree on anything? Is there anything that rises above politics anymore? And many of us would like to answer yes, Mr. Speaker. We'd like to tell the people we work for that yes, on issues of national security and protecting this country, yes, we can come together. We're capable of putting down talking points and red herrings and straw arguments and picking up something called responsibility. Mr. Speaker, to say that this reauthorization has bipartisan support is an understatement. This bill passed unanimously in the House Intelligence Committee, and for those in shock back home, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to repeat that. This bill passed unanimously. All Democrats, all Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee with access to the most amount of information, not a single no vote. President Bush supported this, Mr. Speaker. I will when I'm through. Mr. Obama supports this. National security experts support this. Law enforcement officials support it. Our colleagues, Mr. Speaker, who served in the FBI and federal prosecutors and in the military, they support it. The Democrat-led House passed this bill in 2008 with former Speaker Pelosi giving a glowing speech extolling the virtues of the underlying bill and escorting her colleagues about the necessity of passing it.
Where's Gowdy from?
And all of this happened, Mr. Speaker, because intelligence is the lifeblood of our ability to defend ourselves. It happened, Mr. Speaker, because this bill has nothing to do with Americans on American soil. It happened, it passed, Mr. Speaker, because this provides protections for Americans who are traveling abroad. It passed because there is ample oversight. It passed because it has the needed checks and balances between the legislative branch and the executive branch and the judicial branch. So why the opposition, Mr. Speaker? How can you explain supporting something when Ms. Pelosi had the gavel, but you can't support it when Mr. Boehner has the gavel? And what I want to do, Mr. Speaker, just for today, is let's put down the red herrings and let's put down the straw arguments and the misrepresentations. This bill doesn't implicate the Bill of Rights any more than it implicates any other part of our Constitution, unless you think that foreign nationals who are on foreign land fall within the protections of the United States Constitution, and that is an absurd argument, Mr. Speaker. Do foreign nationals on foreign land, do they have the right to vote? Do they assert states' rights under the 10th Amendment? Can they claim cruel and unusual punishment? You go to Iran. If you're an Iranian, you go to Iran and assert your 5th Amendment right to Miranda or your 6th Amendment right to counsel and see what happens. But yet we're to believe that the 4th Amendment applies to the entire world? It's absurd, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm almost out of time, but I do want to say this, and I will say this from the bottom of my heart, what's left of it, having been a prosecutor for 16 years, but I want to say this. On Tuesday, Mr. Speaker, and I believe you were with us.
The gentleman's recognized.
I believe you were with us, Mr. Speaker. I believe all of our colleagues were on the steps of the Capitol. And we came together to remember 9/11 and what we lost and what we still grieve for as a nation. And, Mr. Speaker, what we found as a nation in the aftermath of 9/11. And Republicans stood with Democrats on this, the steps of the People's House, and conservatives stood with progressives, with moderates and libertarians beside us. We were just Americans. And that was enough on Tuesday. We were united. We were just Americans. Even for just one fleeting moment, in our desire to honor, protect, and defend. If we can come together, Mr. Speaker, to remember 9/11, surely we can come together to prevent another one. And I would ask my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one respects the gentleman from South Carolina more than I do, but I should advise him that it is incorrect to say that members of the Intelligence Committee didn't support my amendment to shorten the sunset period. I have the names of two of them in front of me right now. And I also would advise him that the authority unquestionably affects United States persons, citizens on American soil, that their communications are regularly intercepted. And that would, I think, allow him to join in with some of the rationale for the resistance to this measure as it appears right now. And so it's in that spirit that I point out to him that the lack of transparency, no oversight, the length of the measure is too long, and that this is being brought up under a closed rule was part of our objections, and I think they're in good faith. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the gentleman from Georgia, distinguished member of Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, and I'd like to recognize him for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to H.R. 5949, which, without benefit of one oversight hearing by the full Judiciary Committee during the 112th Congress, would for 5 long years reauthorize expiring provisions of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act without important modifications that are necessary to safeguard the civil liberties and the privacy rights of American citizens. Although H.R. 5949 is designed to defend the United States against international terrorism and other threats, it has been reported that FISA has resulted in the illegal surveillance of untold numbers of American citizens through data accumulation, also known as overcollection of voice and data communications. Overcollection occurs when the voice and data of American citizens is collected incidentally to the collection of communications of foreigners. What happens to the data and voice communications of Americans is incidentally collected without a warrant? What happens to it? What happens to the private voice and data of Americans when it's minimized? These are critical questions and they deserve critical answers, but as I said, we've not had one oversight hearing in the full Judiciary Committee on this issue. We've just simply had a markup of this reauthorization bill. These and other questions deserve answers. The Fourth Amendment would ordinarily protect the communications of American citizens. It prohibits unreasonable and warrantless searches and seizures of the communications of American citizens, including warrantless eavesdropping and snooping. But under H.R. 5949, no warrant or showing of probable cause exists where information is over-collected. In 2009, the New York Times described the practice, 30 more seconds.
Yes, 30 more seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
In 2009, the New York Times described the practice of over-collection as significant and systemic. Any counterterrorism measure must have a solid constitutional footing and respect the privacy and the civil liberties of American citizens. For that reason, I urge my colleagues to vote against this 5-year reauthorization, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
On this side, so I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from
Mr.
Michigan.
Speaker, I'm pleased now to recognize my good friend from Ohio, Dennis Kucinich, for a period of 3 minutes.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Conyers, and to my friends on the other side of the aisle who have expressed passion about passing this. You're good Americans. I respect your position. I respectfully disagree. We have to defend our country from attacks from outside. I voted, along with other members of this Congress, right after 9/11 for the United States to defend itself. But it's equally important that we not lose our freedoms and our constitutional protections while we're engaged in that defense. And we take an oath not only to defend the Constitution, but we have to keep in mind that that oath and that Constitution is really part of America's first line of defense. You know, I think of what it's like to make a phone call. Any one of us right now. We make a phone call, even from this Capitol, call a friend overseas, start talking about matters relating to what's happening in America, what's happening in the world. The way this law is written, without changes, those phone calls could be intercepted. They can not only be intercepted, but they can be downloaded, transcribed, and stored for future use by the government. I have a problem with that, and it's a great concern. What happens is that everyone then becomes suspect when Big Brother's listening. Now, see, I don't think that government should have the right to listen into people's phone calls unless there's a warrant. Then you have probable cause. That's what the Fourth Amendment's about. This bill doesn't have those protections. It extends government's authority to conduct surveillance of persons reasonably believed to be outside the United States for 5 years, and there's a blanket extension which is an abdication of Congress's constitutional obligation to protect and defend the Constitution and to protect the civil liberties of all Americans. Now, given the information we know about our government's past abuse of surveillance authorities, if we pass this bill without any changes to ensure adequate congressional oversight and transparency, we're losing an opportunity. Since the amended FISA Act passed in 2008, the government's released very little information on how it uses the powers granted under this act. As the Electronic Frontier Foundation recently pointed out, nobody in the government is willing to answer questions about how many Americans' phone calls or emails have been or are being collected and read without a warrant under the authority of the FISA Amendment Acts. So Big Brother is not accountable. Even more disturbing is that it is well known that the government has violated the FISA Amendments Act despite the broad surveillance authorities provided to the government. A Freedom of Information request by the ACLU revealed that violations of the FISA Amendments Act and the Constitution continue to occur on a regular basis until at least March 2010. And according to the ACLU, the law is written so broadly that a phone call by a U.S. citizen to someone overseas discussing general... half a minute?
30 more seconds. Gentleman's recognized for 30 seconds.
To a phone call by a U.S. citizen to someone overseas discussing general foreign affairs could be listened in on. Section 702 of this Act allows the government to intercept the communication of any U.S. citizen absent probable cause in subversion of their Fourth Amendment rights. So Big Brother's listening. There's no doubt that Congress is abdicating its responsibility when it passes a blanket extension of this bill without knowing how many Americans have been affected by surveillance under FISA or the government's interpretation of the law. Without vital civil liberty safeguards and minimum transparency, an extension should be rejected. Big Brother is now accountable. Let's vote against Big Brother. Let's vote to protect the Fourth Amendment. Yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to include my statement in the record, and I yield the remaining time to my friend from Oregon, Earl Blumenauer.
Without objection, the gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank Ranking Member Conyers for his courtesy. For over a decade, I have deeply been concerned about the potential overreach of wiretapping legislation and efforts at the NSA. I have voted repeatedly in the past against unreasonable expansion of any administration's ability to intrude in the lives of unknowing and innocent Americans, and I will do so again today. I remain confident that the dedicated members of the intelligence community do not need to erode the rights of Americans in order to protect them. Any apparent gains in security that may be achieved are modest and more than outweighed by longer-term potential loss of civil liberties and oversight, the sense of security that each American deserves. I'm troubled by the implications for our Fourth Amendment rights, the absence of meaningful court review, and the risk to American liberties that stem from the FISA Amendments Act. Frankly, I see no reason to rush into voting on a bill so deficient. The American people would be better served if we continued the debate and the examination, had thorough answers from NSA, and took up reauthorization based on a more complete review and process. In fact, I think as we stand here today on the floor, not even the NSA knows the extent to which FISA Amendment Acts may potentially have been abused. The right approach would be refining this bill and, more broadly, taking a closer look at what, over the last decade, has become an intelligence community that is, frankly, some feel, growing out of control. It's been over 11 years since 9/11. We ought to be able to get this right. We shouldn't be rushed into doing something that has significant long-term implications for every American. You know, take a deep breath and take a step back. There are over 4.2 million Americans who hold a security clearance. That's more than the entire state of Oregon's population, and let's throw in the city of Seattle for good measure. And almost half of them hold top secret security clearance.
more than people who reside in Maine or Idaho. When you've got those millions of people, you have an entity that is cumbersome and potential for abuse and, frankly, potential to be infiltrated or mistakes. Think about it. 9/11 occurred in part not because we didn't have information. Remember the memo on Bush's desk warning of a potential attack from bin Laden? What we are doing at the same time we're eroding American rights, we're piling on more and more and more information, and it's going to be extraordinarily difficult to sort through. We risk putting Americans in trouble.
Gentleman will suspend. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the vote we cast on the FISA Amendments Act tonight will be one of the most important votes we cast in this Congress, and it is appropriate we do so during the week of 9/11. The FISA Amendments Act will continue to allow us to conduct surveillance of terrorists, spies, and others who would do us harm. A FISA court order is required if the target is a U.S. citizen, but not if the individual is outside of the United States and not a U.S. citizen. The FISA Amendments Act was first passed in 2008 overwhelmingly and expires at the end of December. This bill extends the law for 5 years. The FISA Amendments Act is a top priority of the intelligence community. It was supported by the Bush administration in 2008 and is strongly endorsed by the Obama administration now. This is a bipartisan bill that enables us to both neutralize threats to our national security and protect the civil liberties of American citizens. I urge my colleagues to support this bill and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.
It's okay, Monica. I think it's okay.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pursuant to the rule, I claim the general debate time allocated for the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I might consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 5949, which would reauthorize the FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Amendments Act of 2008, or FAA, as we refer to it, for 5 years. The FAA is currently scheduled to expire at the end of the year. If that happens, the government will lose a critical tool for protecting Americans from foreign threats, including terrorists, and as a result, will lose significant intelligence on these foreign targets. And I want to emphasize, Mr. Speaker, foreign targets. We are all reminded yesterday, while looking back on the horrible events of 9/11, of the threat that we face from those seeking to do us harm. Let me reassure you that even though we've been able to disrupt numerous plots over the years, our enemies want to do just as much harm today as they did then, and they just want to do it as badly as they did even 11 years ago. The original FAA that is being reauthorized was sponsored by Representative Reyes in 2008, my Democrat predecessor as chairman of the Intelligence Committee. and also reflected the hard work of then-Leader Hoyer to help develop the final product under the previous majority. I've been pleased to work in a collegial, bipartisan manner with my ranking member, Mr. Ruppersberger, on this clean reauthorization bill as well. In fact, the Intelligence Committee reported this bill out unanimously, which doesn't happen all that much around this place. The administration has also indicated to us that reauthorizing the FAA is its highest national security legislation priority, and on Tuesday issued a statement strongly supporting this bill. I hope we can all recognize this is an issue that is being driven by our national security needs and not by politics. A few key points on the FAA. First, if we let this authority expire, we will lose a critical intelligence collection tool against foreigners on foreign soil. If that happens, we lose information on the plan and identities of terrorists, information about the functioning of terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and others, information on the intentions and capabilities of weapons proliferators, information on potential cyber threats to the United States, and other critical intelligence about foreign adversaries that threaten the United States of America. Second, it is important to remember that this authority is focused on allowing the government to conduct intelligence collection targeting foreigners located outside of the United States. I'm going to say that again, Mr. Speaker. Targeting foreigners located outside of the United States and not on Americans located in the United States or anywhere else in the world. Third, the FAA is subject to a robust oversight structure, including Congress. And I can assure you that the Intelligence Committee takes this responsibility extremely seriously. We have had numerous hearings, member briefings, staff briefings since the passage of FAA in 2008. Before the government can collect any intelligence under the FISA Amendments Act, a federal judge must approve the government's surveillance process, including the targeting and minimization procedures required under the law. One final point. In addition to the primary authority in FAA to target foreigners located abroad, it actually enhanced the civil liberties protection for Americans by requiring a court order to target an American for collection outside of the United States. Before 2008, the government only needed the Attorney General for approval. Now, if this law expires, so do these enhanced civil liberties protections. Mr. Speaker, contrary to what some may say, FAA is not about domestic surveillance, and it does not authorize a sweeping dragnet of collections collecting on American communications. This is about foreigners on foreign soil. It is about giving our intelligence professionals the tools they need to quickly and effectively intercept the communications of those outside the United States who seek to do us harm. Let's not forget the nature of the threat that almost 11 years ago to the day took so many lives in such a horrific way. And the examples that we see just yesterday of the ongoing target of U.S. civilians, if they're in the United States or they're in places like Libya, continues to be a threat to the personal safety of those we ask to stand in harm's way and protect and promote the values of the United States. This is a critical piece of legislation supported by both parties. The President of the United States, Mr. Speaker, I would urge all of our colleagues here to stand united in the defense of the United States and support H.R. 5949, and I would reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I rise today in favor of the FISA Amendments Act, which is due to expire at the end of this year. When Chairman Rogers and I took over the leadership of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, we made a commitment to work together to ensure the intelligence community has the authorities it needs to effectively protect our country while also protecting the privacy of Americans. I believe we must reauthorize this critical piece of legislation to keep America and her citizens safe. The FISA Amendments Act allows the government to gain important intelligence about terrorists, cyber threats, weapons of mass destruction, and nuclear weapons that threaten Americans and U.S. interests. There is a misconception out there that this act permits the surveillance of Americans without a court order. The bill prohibits the targeting of American citizens without a court order, no matter where they're located in the world. The FISA Amendments Act gives the U.S. government the authority to collect intelligence information about foreigners located outside of the United States. The FISA Amendments Act is subject to aggressive oversight by Congress and the executive branch. And there was an issue in the hearing before the judiciary hearing about the issue of oversight. In this Congress alone, the House Intelligence Committee has held multiple hearings, briefings, and more than a dozen meetings concerning FISA. In addition, every 60 days, the Department of Justice and the Director of National Intelligence conduct detailed on-site reviews to ensure compliance with the provisions of the Act. This is a bipartisan bill that passed out of the House Intelligence Committee by the unanimous vote of 17-0. I understand some Democrats would like a 3-year extension of the FISA Amendment Act. Some Republicans requested a 9-year extension. The administration asked for a 5-year extension to take the presidential year politics out of the process while also providing consistency to the intelligence community. I support the President's request for a 5-year extension. Without reauthorization, this critical tool would be lost, putting our nation at severe risk. We would not be able to obtain the foreign intelligence necessary to prevent terrorist plots and cut off their sources of financial support. I believe the FISA Amendments Act is critical to protecting our nation while protecting our Americans' constitutional rights and privacy. I urge my colleagues to support this measure. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves.
Mr. Speaker, can I yield to a friend of mine 2 minutes to the gentleman from California?
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized and yields to the gentleman from California.
I thank the Chairman for recognizing me and yielding time to me. Mr. Speaker, I'm one of those Democrats that the ranking member talked about that would prefer a 3-year extension of this measure, but I'm going to vote for H.R. 5949, the FISA Amendments Act Reauthorization Bill of 2012, also known as the FAA. I support this legislation because it protects our security, preserves our freedom, and has proven to respect our civil liberties in the process. In 2008, many of us were rightly concerned about this program being created and used as a backdoor for collecting information on law-abiding Americans. I voted against the FAA in 2008, in part because of these civil liberty concerns. However, as a member of the House Intelligence Committee, I believe the abuses that we feared have just not materialized. But let me be clear, and this and future administrations are being given fair warning. My colleagues and I on the House Intelligence Committee will continue to receive reports on FISA information collection. These reports must continue to be detailed and specific. If there are any abuses or problems stemming from the application of this program, I'm certain that this Congress will move swiftly to correct them. So far, the application of FAA has gained our trust, but we will continue to verify how the FAA is being used. Trust, but verify. Mr. Speaker, the FAA provides the tools we need to collect vital counterterrorism information and foreign intelligence. I will vote in favor of H.R. 5949, the FISA Amendments Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan reserves?
Continue to reserve.
Yes. Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Jan Schakowsky, 1 minute.
The gentlelady from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute when she arrives.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to this FISA legislation. I do want to thank my ranking member for yielding to me despite our difference of opinion. As a member of the Intelligence Committee, I take the threat of terrorism very seriously. But I believe we are fully capable of protecting our security and safeguarding our precious civil liberties. This law authorizes the government to collect mass electronic communications coming into and going out of the United States so long as no U.S. person in the United States is intentionally targeted. Yet in April 2009, the New York Times reported that the National Security Agency, quote, intercepted private email messages and phone calls of Americans on a scale that went beyond the broad legal limits established by the Congress, unquote. Shouldn't our government be required to disclose more about the extent and nature of the surveillance? Is this an authority that should be extended until 2017? Shouldn't we at least be able to consider an amendment to re-examine this law in 2013? But no amendments are allowed today. I urge a no vote, and I yield back.
The gentlelady's yield. Time has expired. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I might consume. It's just important to remember that the due process protections of the United States are alive and well here. This is one of those programs that has an inordinate amount of oversight to make sure that we are not targeting Americans. Not only does the committee participate, but the Department of Justice has a separate review. There are strong internal reviews. And in the odd case where an American is intercepted, there have very strict procedures on how to destroy that information and correct that problem. And it has not happened hardly frequently at all, is the good news, and which is why I think there is such bipartisan and strong support of our effort, again, to collect on foreigners who are outside of the United States. Incredibly important. So I would continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland.
Yes, I yield the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, a minute and a half.
Gentleman from California is recognized for a minute and a half.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in support of the FISA Amendments Act reauthorization. This bill reauthorizes intelligence gathering capabilities that are essential to our national security while also protecting the civil liberties of Americans. The recent events in Libya, Egypt, and elsewhere should serve to remind us all that there remain forces around the world that are determined to kill Americans, injure our interests, and jeopardize our freedoms. The FAA allows us to obtain critical information about terrorist organizations, nuclear proliferation, and a host of other dangers. These authorities have produced intelligence that's vital to defending the nation against international terrorism and other threats, which is why Attorney General Holder and DNI Clapper have called reauthorizing the FAA their top legislative priority. This bill does not authorize spying on Americans. To the contrary, the 2008 FISA Amendments Act ensured that no American, whether within the United States or overseas, would come under surveillance without a court order and a finding of probable cause. The authorities provided are narrowly tailored to the purpose of protecting the United States from those who would harm us, and I urge an aye vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland reserves.
Reserve.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Good job.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers. I'm going to continue to reserve and allow the gentleman from Maryland to...
Mr. Speaker, can you tell me how much time that we do have?
Yes. The gentleman from Maryland has 5 minutes remaining, and the gentleman from Michigan has 2 minutes remaining.
Okay. Well, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, there's been talk about the FISA Amendments Act as a backdoor collection on Americans and does not sufficiently protect civil liberties. This is not the case. We're all Americans. We're members of Congress. We care about our country. We care about our Constitution. And we care about our privacy and our civil liberties. Now, the FISA Amendments Act of 2008 actually expanded protections of American civil liberties and privacy interests. Before the FISA Amendments Act in 2008, which became law then, the government needed only the Attorney General's authorization to target an American. Because of the FISA Amendments Act, if the government allows for surveillance of an American, that American must be overseas and the government must have a FISA court order if they do target an American anywhere in the world. The civil liberties of Americans are better protected than before this act became law in 2008. Also, as far as oversight, and there have been allegations of not a proper oversight. I understand the argument, and I don't disagree with the argument about sunsets. Sunsets are good because they hold us accountable. We can see if there are any abuses, and we can deal with them when we have sunsets. However, the Department of Justice and the Director of National Intelligence file semi-annual reports with Congress as it relates to the FISA Act. These reports include information about compliance, targeting, and minimization on collections involving the parties that we're focused on. The Intelligence Committee staff have conducted dozens of meetings about the authorities under the FISA amendments. These meetings have addressed compliance, procedures, authorities, and specific collection. On the Intelligence Committee, we review, investigate, and debate the FISA Amendments Act. We maintain an ongoing dialogue with the intelligence community to ensure the law is being implemented and how it was intended. We, as Americans, need to know more about the threats that are out there. Our threats for cyber attacks are occurring as we speak right now. It's very dangerous. These attacks can affect our national security, our grid systems, our banking systems, our air traffic control systems. And this bill, this amendment, is part of our protection in dealing with those major issues. Now, I still reserve my time, but I'm ready to close, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Maryland reserves. Gentleman from Michigan.
I reserve for the right to close.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I yield again myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
The FISA Amendments Act is the result of decades of work to modify a law so we can adapt with changing technology and evolving national security threats. The bill demonstrates what Democrats and Republicans can do when we work together in a bipartisan way. It is uniquely important to put partisanship aside when America's national security is at stake. We all have the same goal of keeping America safe from terrorist threats, whether on land or sea, in the air, or with cyberspace. We also believe strongly, and this is very important, in the Constitution and the protections granted by our founding fathers. The FISA Amendments Act is an important tool that has successfully prevented terrorist attacks on American soil. I know it is critical to our intelligence community. I commend everyone who participated in this effort, especially the bipartisan leadership of Chairman Rogers and the other members of the Intelligence Committee on both sides of the aisle. I support this straight authorization, which President Obama, our Commander-in-Chief, has said is vital to protect our nation. I will vote for the FISA Amendments Act Reauthorization Act of 2012, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my ranking member, Mr. Ruppersberger, for the fine bipartisan effort